Luke, the author of the fourth gospel chronologically, and its follow up, the Acts of the Apostles, winds together, for me anyway, one of the most intriguing stories about Paul here. This is classic Paul, Paul the evangelist at his best. Most disciplined students of Paul agree that he wasn't a systematic theologian. He didn't leave us with a single description of his beliefs that we can apply to all people in all times under all circumstances. But Paul was a brilliant evangelist who could think on his feet. So, in his account, Luke tells us that Paul had been going from town to town throughout Greece, evangelizing, reasoning, as it were, not only with the Hellenized Jewish people in their synagogues, but also in the marketplaces and in the Areopagus of Athens with Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Paul seems to have been able to move from one context, one way of thinking and talking about God, to a completely different one, and to really be able to connect, at least with some. Indeed, the results here were mixed. Not only were some Greek cultured Jewish men persuaded, but, Luke says, a great many Greeks and not a few leading women were also. But that repeating theme also persisted. The Jews became jealous, and with the help of some ruffians in the marketplace, they formed a mob and set the city of Thessalonica in an uproar. Where have we heard that before? But remember, keep in mind that the Jews here was a reference to Jewish authorities, chief priests, church elders, the powerful social elites, not to the common Jewish person. Don't ever forget that here. So Paul and Silas, though embraced by some, were thrown out of town. And the same thing happened, it says, in Berea. The Jews of Thessalonica followed them and stirred up a crowd against them there also. So Paul continued down to Athens, where he was deeply distressed by a city full of idols. Athens was a port city, very affluent and diverse. It would have had statues to all the gods and shrines galore. Remember from your high school days reading the Iliad and the Odyssey and learning the elaborate stories of the escapades of all the Greek gods? Well, that's what Paul had stepped into. Paul was pushed over the top by an altar to an unknown God. Now, it may have been that this was just the people's superstitious way to make sure that they'd covered the bases with all the gods. But it would seem that Paul picked up on it here, at least for some, as perhaps a means to truly be inclusive of a yet unknown, undiscovered deity, one that at least some were still groping for, or at least ought to be groping for. So, Paul being Paul, he took on the Greek intellectuals and city elders. And he was really sharp. He started with that unknown God. And then he quoted to these philosophers the words from their very own prized predecessors. He did it to argue that not only is the God of all gods not made of silver and gold, but the God they still long for is so much different than humans make him out to be. Much more organic instead. This is such an amazing account by Luke. The peasant Jews were concerned about the Messiah, when he would come, how, and if he had or hadn't already. The Jews Chief priests, council elders, and others in positions of authority were only about control, jealous of anyone who could bring together people to a different message or a different way of thinking, and those who had resorted to stirring up the crowds, the mobs, the emotions. But Paul was now speaking to a people who actually did spend their time in telling and hearing something new, as Luke put it. As Luke referred to those who are open to a new set of ideas, even from this outsider. Now, maybe Luke is actually calling the reader to do similarly. So notice first, Paul didn't seek to convince these philosophers or Greek congressmen that the Jewish Messiah had come. He didn't try to convince them that Jesus of Nazareth was God. He went instead to where they were. His only goal was to help them see that God is simpler, much closer, not opulent like their shrines and cathedrals, and not so humanly heroic and victorious as their statues. Wasn't there God, Jesus' message? Paul, or at least Luke, the writer of this account, referred to the words of two much earlier philosophers. It was the Jewish philosopher Aratus, who wrote in the introduction to one of his famous poems an attribute to the god of honor and justice, who was Zeus. He wrote, "For we too are his offspring." And Paul quoted this. Zeus was the ruler of all gods, the establisher and enforcer of all laws. He was the standard for kings to follow, ensuring that they did not abuse the power of their position. Paul quoted this of this unknown God. And it was the Greek philosopher Epimenides, 400 years before Aratus, who also wrote of Zeus, saying, "But you are not dead. You live and abide forever. For in you we live and move and have our being." And Paul quotes this also to them, most likely because he felt the same about Christ. With these words, Paul referred the intellectuals to the God of all gods. In him we live and move and have our being. For we too are his offspring, all of us. You seek something more. A yet unknown God still tugs at you. Well, that's the very nature of the God above all gods. When you really stop to see the world around you and through the lens of history, you naturally seek him, perhaps even grope after him and find him. Do that. This is what Paul was telling them. There are these two fish swimming along, and they happen to meet another older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two fish swim on for a bit, and the one eventually turns to the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" God is that in which we live and move and have our being. Fish don't have much intellectual power, so it's understandable they probably don't notice the water, let alone contemplate it. Yet humans were created in the image of this God, and so we ought to notice the water and contemplate it, as these philosophers were doing, that Paul has a chance to speak to. God is in the air we breathe, the earth upon which we walk, the wonders that should stir us, and the center, the soul that seeks to connect us and afford us the most profound blessings of life. Have you stopped to hear that wise fish? The call of God to notice the water? Or do you still swim around in it like the oblivious, self-centered fish, lost in a materialistic, self-centered understanding of God, a God made in the image of humans? Have you missed the water? God in all that's around you. God in the air you breathe, and therefore in the plants that create the air that you breathe. God in the sun and rain that nurture the plants, that create the air that you breathe. God in the earth that provides stability and nutrients for the plant, watered and energized by the sun to create the air that you breathe. God in all life that is sustained by the earth, the water, the sun, the plants, and the air that we all breathe. No, it's not just New Age. It dates all the way back to Paul. And now is especially the time to see and to learn from this. We need to notice the same water that we all swim in, get the same virus in, and need to act as one in to overcome. We need to learn from this for the future, so we'll swim even more together in the one same God that calls us to be in him, that he might be in all, like the fish in the water, and the water in the fish. Some listened to the wise fish as he passed by. Some arrogantly and selfishly responded, "What the hell is water?" Let us stop and notice the water, and then be one in the one same God, truly in it together. Think on this. Amen.